one of the hosts of the house says, please come to one of these meetings with me so I can show you before you make any kind of decision on the spiritualist. And she had an open mind and she went. And she got so frightened at the beginning that she ran all the way home and fell to her knees and once again prayed she wouldn't go to hell. And by, they said, well, maybe you had a bad experience. Let's do one more time. And she went to this lady's house named Mrs. Kellogg. Now, Mrs. Kellogg was a wonderful medium. And she went in this little room up high on the staircase in this old house in New York. And she said, you're going to be a beautiful, wonderful, brilliant spiritualist medium. And she didn't believe it, of course. And she says, I want you to sit at the table. Remember in those days they had the alphabet. You know, like a Ouija board, but without the Ouija board, it had the alphabet. So that's how they used to get their messages, knockings and rappings, because this is early days, remember. So she sat at the table with the alphabet, and the medium, at that time, Mrs. Kellogg, sat off to the side. And it gave her information. It gave her information, and I'll explain a little bit more later, that she couldn't deny. And she ran home and told her mother, and her mother said, oh no, we're all going to hell now. But she told her mother everything that had transpired, and her mother could not deny it. And so between her mother and herself, they started sitting at the table with the alphabet. And that wasn't long after. So this little bit here is called He Being Dead Yet Speaketh. As an aid to my future development, I have been advised by Mrs. Kellogg to use the alphabet and to continue to sit at stated periods for practice. This I promise to do, but not finding the requisite leisure, my convictions of the spiritual origin of my previous performances waxed weaker and weaker with the lapse of every hour. I mentioned in a former chapter that I had come to America in the steamship Pacific, one of the Collins lines. Ever since my arrival in New York, I had maintained a kindly intercourse with some of the officials of the ship, between whom myself and little acts of friendship were exchanged every time she came to port. The ship Pacific was due on the Memorial Day when I became developed as a medium, to wit, on Tuesday, February 19, 1856. Imagine knowing when you become a medium. They wouldn't do that today. On Wednesday, I went down to the wharf in hope of receiving a little package that was to be sent to me from England, in charge of an officer, between whom he and myself, the most kindly acquaintance, had been kept up ever since our landing. The ship had not arrived, and no tidings were received of her. But as she was only due some 30 hours, and the season rendered it likely that wintry storms would occasion the delay, no anxiety was felt in consequence. That evening, just as Mother and I were about to retire for the night, a sudden and unusual chill crept over me, and an irresistible impression possessed my mind that a spirit had come into our presence. A sensation as if water was streaming over me, accompanied by the icy chilliness I experienced. And a feeling of indescribable terror possessed my whole being. I begged my mother to light up every lamp we had at hand, then to open the door, that the proximity of people in the house outside the room might aid to dissipate the horror that seemed to pervade the very air. At last, at my mother's suggestion, I consented to sit at the table with the alphabet we had provided, turned from me and towards her, so my finger, which some power seemed to guide in pointing out the letters. In this way was rapidly spelled out, Philip Smith, Ship Pacific. For a few moments, this mode of manifestation ceased, and to my horror, I distinctly felt an icy cold hand laid on my arm. Then distinctly and visibly to my mother's eyes, something pulled my hair, which was hanging in long curls. All the while the coldness of the air increasing so painfully that the apartment seemed to be pervaded by Arctic breezes. After a while, my own convulsed hand was moved tremblingly, but very rapidly, to spell out, "My dear Emma, I have come to tell you that I am dead. The ship Pacific is lost, and all on board have perished. She and her crew will never be heard from more." There was little or no sleep for me that night, and as my mother's suggestion, immediately after breakfast the next morning, I set off to consult our good friend Mrs. Kellogg, as she had herself earnestly requested me to do in any emergency when I might desire her advice. Despite the unexpected nature of the message I had received and the power with which it came, I still doubted. And it was in that frame of mind that I hurried up to Mrs. Kellogg's lodgings. As I ascended the 2 flights of stairs that led to the apartments I sought, I noticed that I was being followed by an old gentleman who seemed to be climbing up after me, though with far less ease and speed. Arriving at the landing, what was my surprise to see Mrs. Kellogg coming out of her own room, her large blue eyes fixed and glazed, as if in the same trance condition in which I had beheld her before. Walking straight up to me, she took my hand and said in a forced, unnatural voice, "My dear Emma, I have come to tell you I am dead. The ship Pacific is lost, and all on board have perished. She and her crew will never be heard from more." "Great heaven!" I exclaimed, waking up Mrs. Kellogg from my energetic cry. "Look here!" And then, holding out the paper I brought with me, I read in a loud and, I suppose, excited tone the message I had received the night before, with the facsimile of her words, except in respect to the signature. At this moment our interview was interrupted by the old gentleman who had followed me up the stairs, and who now cried in a loud and angry voice, "You are a pair of impostors. How dare you prophesy the loss of my ship?" "Oh, Mr. Collins, is that you?" said Mrs. Kellogg, from whom I afterward learned that the poor old gentleman was none other than Mr. Collins, the proprietor of the line of the ship Pacific belonged. He had been also the proprietor of the ship Arctic, on which his own hapless wife and child had perished in a fearful wreck occasioned by collision with an iceberg. Without having learned of any of these particulars, I simply found I was de trop and in the scene, and then a scurrying, so having quietly whispered to Mrs. Kellogg, "I received this communication through the alphabet last night, and placed my copy in her hand, and I at once withdrew. And I have since heard from the poor old gentleman, E.K. Collins, after the loss of his wife and daughter on his ship, the Arctic, had often consulted Mrs. Kellogg as to their fate, and was a firm believer in spiritualism. Still, he was perhaps justly angry when he heard our predicting the loss of poor Pacific within only a few days of her expected arrival. And I need not remind my readers that this statement was strictly verified by subsequent results. The ship Pacific and her ill-fated crew were never heard from more. Thank you for listening.